greetings at Press Center. Greetings to everyone who watches online. The topic of the first press briefing of the day, presentation of report. Should Ukraine drop sanctions against Russian tech companies? Our guests are Olga, Kyrylyuk, PhD, CEO and founder of the influencer platform, and we will be joined by Maria Shagina, PhD researcher at Center for Eastern European Studies in Zurich. Now I give the floor to the moderator, Anastasia. Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm Anastasia Lachlat. I represent the team of Freedom House. Unfortunately, Maxim Tuliev, member of the board of the Internet Association of Ukraine, won't be able to join us. And we would like to hear about the position of business of Internet provider, one of the key players of this process. And we understand the situation, and we wish Maxim good health. Now we go back to our presentation. Before giving the floor to Olga Kyrylyuk, who is the author of this report, I would like to tell several words. International Human Rights Protection Organization is clear in its declarations and actions in Ukraine and provides priority to human rights in its analysis and development of the state policy and any other decisions that influence political process, especially in times of de facto war with Russian Federation. Taking this into account, this political decision to introduce economic and other limitations against thousands of Russian physical and legal entities. Tens of thousands of internet pages were blocked in the territory of Ukraine, and this decision was a cornerstone. And Freedom House and different international institutions and Ukrainian activists from the coalition of Free Internet, we see that this decision was really critical, and it was influential. It influenced the approach to internet relations in internet, freedom of expression, and it has economic effect because these are sanctions. And in 2017, we decided to invite Olga Kyrylyuk. She is one of the key experts and media lawyers to check these sanctions, whether they correspond to international law and whether they produce economic effect. And this economic efficiency of these sanctions, we invited Maria Shagina to comment on this topic. And she focuses on the analysis of sanctions for protection of national interests. First, I would like to give the floor to Olga Kyrylyuk for a brief presentation. Thank you, Anastasia. Today, we're going to speak about the analysis. It is called "Should Ukraine Drop Sanctions Against the Russian Tech Companies?" And you see a background in this photo. Here there is an elevator hall, and you see that these actions can have consequences for the free expression of opinion in Ukraine. When state introduces limitations, we should understand when it will be able to stop. Whether national security will be the only important thing in this respect, or whether there will be other grounds for further limitations. And as of today, we see that in Ukraine, before we had unlimited access to all online resources in Ukraine, and it was the country with free internet, and now it's like being dropped in this mine of the elevator. And we see the consequences. Some people forget about it. part of society got accustomed to the sanctions that were introduced, and part of society was indifferent, and part of society agreed that it was necessary, taking into account the fact that in the country the war is ongoing and there is a threat to national security. But I would like to pay attention to the fact that freedom of expression is one of the main rights in the digital age. And the state should protect freedom of expression. And in this way, we may establish whether the country chose democratic way of development. And the people should be provided with opportunity to freely express their opinion. Of course, we should take into account some limitations. For example, hate speech should not be allowed, or some pornographic materials, they should not be disseminated. We understand that these are rightful limitations, and all the states adhere to this. But many countries try to introduce additional limitations, and in this way to control the channels of spread of information through which citizens may promote information. And the national security is the biggest argument for the limitation of freedom of speech, and it's easy to manipulate with this argument because we understand for each person and for each conscious citizen of the country, the security of the country will be the top priority. And in Ukraine, national security and freedom of expression became opposite. So they should be protected the same way, but there was opposition instead. For example, you have freedom of expression or you support the national security, and this created polarization in Ukrainian society. Moreover, why the case of Ukraine is interesting? Because the mechanism of economic sanctions was used. When we speak about economic sanctions, we mean that some economic effect should be reached. And when sanctions were introduced in 2017, a lot has been said that the end aim of introducing of these sanctions was protection of information space of Ukraine and fighting the propaganda that comes from Russian internet sources, and also they spoke about protection of personal data and authors' right protection. There were many grounds in order to motivate the introduction of economic sanctions. But these arguments do not correlate with the economic consequences, and these sanctions should produce economic effect, because when we speak about economic sanctions, we mean that there should be some economic effect, and there should be some real indicators how to measure this economic effect. And this didn't happen, and some people said that Russian internet platforms should lose economically here in Ukraine because this money was used for financing Russian aggression in Ukraine. But in reality, when it is said by the government, there should be clear mechanism envisaged that should help analyze the process, and they should carry out analysis whether the sanctions are efficient. Economic indicators should be provided that would confirm that the profits of internet companies fell, and that the goals of economic sanctions were reached. But as we had it in the beginning, the goals that were declared, they didn't correlate with the nature of economic sanctions. That's why now it is difficult to say whether these goals were reached. Also, there are many questions about timeliness, proportionality, and legality of such limitations. The conflict started in 2014, and sanctions were introduced only mid-2017. Here, there is a question whether these sanctions be able to resolve the problem of the spread of untrue information or information aggression, and in 2017 whether it was really necessary to block internet resources, because before this, during 3 years, information freely was disseminated, and it could be easily found in the information space. About proportionality, if we look at international standards of protection of human rights, including freedom of expression, if we look at best practices and also at the decision of the international court institutions, including ECHR, we see that proportionality, it removes the opportunity to take such arbitrary measures that would block access to all resources on the whole. When we speak about proportionality, we should understand that the threat that exists and measures that are implemented on the fight this threat, they should correlate among themselves. When we are speaking about ban on internet platforms, not all the information harms national interests or national security. So this full blocking of all of the resources, this cannot be considered as proportional. When we speak about laws and international standards, according to them, in order to have these legal limitations, they should be envisaged by law, and they should be clearly formulated in order that these entities would be able to clearly understand what is banned, in what way they should adhere to these limitations. First, the ban was introduced illegally. This was done not by law in Ukraine, but by bylaws. And also, in its essence, only executive bodies may do it. For example, it may be done by National Security and Defense Council, and also the terminology that was used in Ukraine. In Ukrainian legislation, there is no such a notion as internet provider. There are operators of telecommunications. So this was done by the entities for the entities that do not exist. And also the Commission on Regulation of Information, it provided also explanations and addressed to internet providers. It addressed not to internet providers, but to providers of internet communications, that they should adhere to this decision of National Security and Defense Council and the President. So there were many collisions of legislation, and people do not understand how to adhere to these bans. Also, we should note that many internet providers in Ukraine, they adhere to these bans, they block these internet resources, and in most cases it happened because there was they didn't understand the consequences in case if they do not adhere to these prohibitions. And then later on, there was no sanction mechanism formed, and if they didn't do it. And so we could imagine the situation if they won't block the access to sanctioned internet resources, maybe there won't be any response from the state, because we understand that in order to, and this is the legal norms, that if there is a sanction and you do not adhere to it, then you will be punished. But here there was prohibition, but there was no mechanism of control. And from the start, often they said that security service will develop some mechanisms, some recommendations, how internet providers should implement this ban and the mechanism will be in place, but there is no such mechanism. It was not developed. There were attempts to approve some documents on this, but it didn't happen. It was not successful, and we didn't move forward, and we didn't reinforce the control over internet. But there is no clear situation. There is prohibition, but people do not understand whether it is efficient. When we are speaking especially concerning economic sanctions, we say that these economic sanctions and people have association. They believe that this is something connected with economy, but the information sources are banned, and this is this results in the fact that there was no big opposition and big criticism to this decision, and the majority of society, people didn't understand what is happening, and you just stop getting access to some resources. Someone adapted, others they maybe found some alternative resources, and they were able to contact with their friends or relatives or to spread information there. And we should recognize that the number of users at the banned platforms, resources that are affiliated with Russia, the number of users, it decreased. And if we are speaking about economic sanctions, the result should be not about the number of users at the platforms. We should have clear economic indicators, and we didn't have it. There was no analysis by the state, nor by some analytical centers, or by some experts. So the information that we can use, the companies that got under sanctions, they published their economic indicators and their turnover in some years, and sanctions didn't influence them much, but we do not know whether this information is true. But taking into account that there is no other data that we could use, this data provides us with some figures if we are speaking about economic indicators. As of today, we also see that in Ukraine, political establishment changed, and we have an interesting situation. We will see whether the new power adhere to the same line of sanctions and blocking of online resources, or they will change their policy completely. Maybe they will take waiting position when in 2020 sanctions and maybe they won't be continued, or the topic won't be raised. And it is interesting to say, when we are speaking about economy in Ukraine, about some losses to these companies, if we want to make or to have some benefits in the provision of national security and interests, it is weird that this topic now is not voiced, and it looks that everything is okay and nothing is going on. But part of these online resources, they will remain under sanctions, because in March 2019, former president continued sanctions against Yandex. In 2020, for Yandex, this story won't end because he continued it for 3 years. Why Yandex? Why not another internet platform that also is connected with Russia? At the moment, there are more questions than answers, and we should take into account that 2 years of sanctions passed, that there are no proper mechanism, no proper analysis of efficiency, and it is difficult to say why these were especially economic sanctions, why this choice was made, and whether these measures, whether they were proportional, such measures. But Something is not working now. But as of today, I believe there exist a number of measures that could be implemented in order to improve the situation. Practically, we cannot change what happened, but we may learn our lessons and we may prevent situations in the future. For this, it is important to understand that in the 21st century, when digital technologies quickly develop, it is difficult to ban something because technologies will allow to avoid such limitations. In Ukraine, this happened, so part of users started to use another access to resources, and it would be more efficient if in Ukraine we would have efficient formation of content that would highlight Ukrainian opinion and will provide understanding to international community about what is going on. And we should have content not only in Ukrainian, we should translate this content in many languages depending on the audience abroad. We want to reach the audience abroad, what message we would like to bring to them. And maybe we should create a platform to provide such information. Also, we should spread this information not only to provide understanding to international community, also we should provide this information to territories that are not under control. And maybe we may use in contact, and many journalists also carried out spread of information and dissemination of information that is true. This information, it should be pro-Ukrainian, and they lost the access to this resource, and they are not able now to reach this part of population that became hostile towards Ukraine and towards Ukrainian government. And when they banned these resources, Ukrainian power also lost one more source of bringing information, the point of view to people who live now in uncontrolled territories. Also, it is important to create a network of fact-checking, because we understand that as of today, it is really difficult to fight fake news and spread of untrue information. But if we had some fact-checking network, it would be easier to fight propaganda materials. Moreover, we should hold multilateral consultations with internet providers, with different stakeholders, private sector. It is important to involve experts, because in Ukraine, one day they took decision to ban access to online resources, and there was no explanation and no consultations, no expert opinions, whether it will be efficient and useful, whether it will help us reach our goal. And we face a situation when sanctions were introduced, but no proper results. Only the decrease of the number of users. This is the only result we got. And also, it is important to provide proper information to society on the whole. The power should communicate what they want to do, what measures will be implemented, and maybe they should also have some form of feedback in order to get the opinion of the public, whether the public is ready to some limitations. Also, it is important to understand what will be the potential influence of limitations on the freedom of speech, especially when we are speaking about a conflict situation and armed conflict that exists in Ukraine, when freedom of expression is also under threat, significant threat. Moreover, the government should adhere to international standards, human rights standards and best practices, and to avoid some arbitrary limitations that were introduced in Ukraine. It is important to properly assess and to provide these limitations in the targeted way in order not to fully block the access to everything that exists. Of course, there are some technologies, but they are more costly. And when we are speaking about economic effect, and if we want to reach concrete results, we should introduce more specialized concrete measures. Of course, ideally, this limitation should be made based on court decisions in order to prevent arbitrary decisions. Also, maybe there should be some campaigns to increase awareness and to provide information to users. And they should know their digital rights. They should understand that the online space is not only when you get access to Google, YouTube, contact, and they should understand that this is one more space where each of us can implement our rights, our human rights and our rights as a citizen. And it is really important for the state to report periodically about the consequences, what was reached in the result, and what indicators and economic indicators were provided for the measurement. Then I believe in this case the trust in society will increase and level of understanding will increase concerning some economic sanctions, whether they are really important. Thank you, Olga, for this wonderful presentation. If you have questions, please note them, write them down. Because now I would like to give the floor to Maria Shagina, and she will provide you with more information about the function of such instrument as economic sanctions and whether it is appropriate to use this instrument in order to fight disinformation. Do you hear us? Yeah. Did you hear my last question? Yeah. Thank you for this invitation. I would like to start my comment. It consists of three parts. First, about Ukrainian legislation concerning sanctions. Then I will speak about sanctions against Russian websites and recommendations that are similar to recommendations that were provided by Olga. Ukrainian sanction policy differs from international practice because it was introduced later on in September 2015. If we compare it with the sanction policy of Japan or Canada, Australia, Ukraine, it only started in September 2015. And if we study the efficiency of sanctions, we should understand how it was formulated. We should understand whether they are efficient. And there are some differences that should be noted. First of all, legislation. If we look at legislation of Australia and Canada, there is clear terminology, what these sanctions mean, and all the measures are stated, because there should not be any interpretation, that it should be clearly stated. And we have laws of 5 or 6 pages, but our legislation does not provide clear understanding of the sanctions. And we also have two types of sanctions, personal and sectoral sanctions. And we believe that the sectoral sanctions are broader and they include blocking. And in practice of USA or European Union, blocking of assets, this is a different category. These are in the US, this is different from European legislation, and sectoral sanctions, by their nature, they were introduced against Russia as sanctions that are not only sectoral. It was about Russian transactions because the economy was really integrated. They only blocked some transactions, they didn't block assets. Also, about information that was mentioned by some journalists, there is no proper structure, no proper type, there are no proper types of sanctions. And also, it is difficult to use the list. And Ukraine provides sanctions against 1,748 private companies, and this is really a lot. An administration of Trump imposed sanctions on 1,500 companies and people, and this is about Iran, Russia. So this list is really long. So the main part of sanction mechanism is the principle of conditionality, to what they connect. So you may find it in the media from the comments or comments from official sources. So there is no clear mechanism in legislation. And monitoring and implementation, they have side effect because the design was not ideal, and the implementation won't be ideal as well. Criminal responsibility, the companies do not bear this responsibility because there are no such articles in the criminal code. The second part, these are sanctions against Russian websites, and here it was stated that there is no such practice in international law. This is reverse situation when, for example, US sanctions some persons in Iran or in Turkey that who blocked websites. So here we face different situation when we block sites as democratic state, not vice versa. About sanctions against Russian websites, we should also note that motivation and the aim of this measure is not clear. There are three components that we may see in the media and statements. They are not clearly made, and the first was to produce economic harm. This was the first motivation. Then fighting disinformation, and third, counteracting to cyber threat. If we look at first motive, this is economic harm. Here we should clearly understand this motivation and the measures that were implemented. First, companies like Laboratory of Kaspersky, they were included in the list in September 2015. If we look at the measures that were used, they do not correspond. This notion of producing economic harm, because what measures were included, if we cite our list, this is limitation of access to communication services and the ban on state procurement. So these are not economic sanctions. The same measures as a ban for state procurement. This was used by USA against Kaspersky or in EU against Kaspersky. We should also state that laboratory of Kaspersky, it is not included in the list in US and in EU. And some countries, Britain, Lithuania, but not Germany, they say that, and about these countries, they banned procurement of antivirus programs by state institutions, not private sector. Second motivation that was stated, this is fighting disinformation. And here, there is no proper practice of using sanctions against disinformation. There are other measures that may be used. Fact-checking, for example, and other mechanisms. For example, creation of more positive content that and also check of negative information to dismantle some myths and to provide awareness, to provide awareness campaigns and critical view. And this measure that they implemented, it didn't help to fight disinformation. And then third one, to counteract cyber attack. And this is new. And in EU, the document was created only in May this year, and the US, they imposed cyber sanctions against North Korea. This is another instrument. It may be used, but what is important is that in our case, we need to differentiate economic sanctions and sanctions against cyber attacks. Now, everything is under one roof. It is difficult to understand how they work and whether they work at all. About recommendations. And my recommendations are similar to Olga's recommendations. So this is legislation should be changed, whether these are economic sanctions, it should be differentiated. This is not only economic sanctions. Sanctions may be diplomatic or visa sanctions. This is not the only instrument. We should differentiate and we should understand what is the result of sanctions, what effect they produce. Second recommendation, maybe we should remember that sanctions, they are not some goal in itself. They should be in a broader context. Now we have sanctions, only sanction lists, and many things are covered by these lists, but they are not part of bigger strategy against Russia in our case. Communication is really important with private sector and with population, because private sector, this is the main actor that implements the sanctions. That's why communication with internet providers is really important. And in this case, the alternative to blocking of content or platform, these alternatives should be created. Otherwise, sanctions will be avoided by other ways. And the last recommendation, after the design of the sanctions, that should be more perfect. There should be proper monitoring and control of implementation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please stay with us in case of questions for you. So I would like to say about reference to this report in Ukrainian and English. So you may find it at Freedom website and Freedom House Facebook page. And if you'd like to read it on paper, we have several copies that were printed out. We may provide these copies to you. Now I would like to give the floor to our dear audience. If you have questions, we will be happy to answer. Dear guests, please raise your hands and ask questions. Thank you. Sorry, I was late. So I'm a postgraduate student at university, and for me it would be really interesting to hear your answer. I'm Bogdan Bernatsky, and I would like to ask Maria and those who prepared this report. I believe that this report is really centered on human rights. Maybe it does not include those who manage these social media, whether they are close to those who directly carry out some actions against Ukraine, whether they are interrelated, whether these networks are really such where information may be freely spread, ideas may be freely spread. I understand the concept. I agree that this was done not ideally, but in your opinion, what about the correlation of this human rights and national security? Maybe too much attention is paid to one point over the other. Thank you for your question. We would like to raise this question because human rights protection, this should be a component, a core of national security. Without focus on people, we won't have national security. We would have nothing to protect, to defend. So this is our position. I believe that the main idea is that national security is really important. But we should not forget about human rights protection and the protection of the country. It is done not to protect some unrealistic thing concerning country. This is about people. And human rights, they should be adhered to. There should be efficient mechanisms to protect them. If you want to limit the rights, you should name it correctly. They should not be named economic sanctions. There are hidden consequences that are big for internet users. I do not say that these networks that were banned or online resources that were banned, I do not say that they are absolute good or they spread some good information, but the matter is not about the resource. This is about the approach. For example, today we ban one resource, tomorrow we will ban the other. So several months ago, not long ago, representatives of security service at one of the press conferences said that maybe we should pay attention also on Twitter and Facebook, because now Russian Federation, they actively use these internet platforms in order to carry out information aggression against Ukraine. So this is not only about those online resources that are directly linked to Russia. So if this ban would resolve this issue, but information space, it is not more protected or safe. If there is direct correlation between the ban and protection of the national security, yeah, but if it is not only prohibition, but maybe some other steps in order to reinforce our information space, yes, maybe this is the case. But when we start with one resource, then we do not know where there will be limitations on such ban. If there are no questions, we thank you for attention. This is the end of press briefing, and you may find all necessary information. You may contact the organizers of the event. Thank you.